We will now have a discursive dive into the Gaia theory. So we will pose questions. What does it mean when we talk about Gaia, the Gaia concepts among the different disciplines, from history of science to philosophy of science to biology and back? Our first guest speaker will be Tim Lenton. Tim is director of the Global Systems Institute and chair of climate change and Earth System Science at the University of Exeter. In his talk, he will ponder on the role of Gaia and Earth systems. Welcome, Tim. Can you hear us?
I can. Thanks for having me at the launch.
You must press the button.
We don't have an audio connection to you right now, but I think in a second it will be established. Yeah, let me introduce the next speaker. After Tim, there will be Sebastian Detroit. Sebastian Detroit is a researcher for the French National Center for Scientific Research at the Aix-Marseille University. He's a philosopher of science and scholar of earth sciences. He is not only a critical zonie, as Bruno Latour likes to call him, but he today is also our zoomie, Sebastian, so we are looking forward to your talk. And for the third impulse on the Gaia topic, Simon Schaffer will direct our steps along history lane. Simon is professor of history of science at the University of Cambridge and, among others, a member of the advisory board of the Scott Polar Research Institute at Cambridge. He is inquiring the discourse on climate history, and his findings are, as I can tell, as exciting to read as they are profound. Simon contributed 2 essays to the Critical Zones exhibition catalog, which I would highly recommend you to read. Tonight he will share his research on animating the Earth with us, which is closely connected to the Gaia theory. Hi, Simon. We are so happy to have you.
Hello. I'm extremely honored, very happy, and extremely surprised to find myself in this company. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, I think we should just have a test that we hear Tim Lenton, and then if we hear him well, we could start with his talk.
Good evening, everybody.
Yay! Wonderful. Well done.
It's not me you've got to congratulate, it's your technical people. Okay, let me try and share the screen.
Mm-hmm.
Just give it a second.
Yeah, so we can see everything fine. And Tim, actually you could take it away.
Thanks very much for your patience, everybody. I thought I'd talk about how and where we might find a safe place to land if we follow Bruno's quest to get down to Earth, to find a terrestrialization, as he calls it. So in my few minutes, I want to talk about some different views of the Earth system and pick one of them as the place to land. Now, it's still quite prevalent in science to take the old providential view that life is just an actor on a stage set by geology, chemistry, and physics. In the old world view ordained by God, I guess, life is just adapting to some given conditions. Now, that view is slowly being replaced by a more accurate one, but it still kind of haunts the field of Earth system science. So we have, for example, notions like the habitable zone around a star, could be our sun, could be any star. The idea that what's habitable is really defined by conditions that can support liquid water, so temperatures that are not too hot and not too cold. They're just right, like for the porridge of the bears in Goldilocks, in this case at some range of distances from a star. That's a very narrow and I would say abiotic definition of habitability. but it's central to what I'm going to call NASA's version of what the Earth system is. And it's certainly still central to the search for potentially inhabited worlds around other stars, so-called extrasolar planets, of which many have now been discovered. But NASA's Earth system is one that was kind of formulated in the 1980s. And like that definition of the habitable zone, it's essentially an abiotic definition of the Earth system. For NASA, there could be a Mars system or there could be a Venus system. Life, there's nothing special about it on life on the Earth in this view. The NASA view of the Earth system is defined by just tracing the interactions between different parts of the system, be they living or rocky or physical and chemical. So there's no special agency for life in this view. And indeed, the whole planet is considered part of NASA's Earth system. At least it is on the longest timescales. And that's puzzling for some of us because the Earth's internal heat source is not really influenced by things at the surface. And if we try to land in this abiotic NASA Earth system, we'd soon be dead because liquid water is far from sufficient conditions for life, including human life. It might be a necessary condition, but there are many others, as we'll see. It's also a little tricky to land in NASA's Earth system because its boundaries, especially its lower boundary, is blurred. I mentioned that in some formulations it includes the whole of the planet, the whole planetary body, the Earth. But actually, the inner boundary of this Earth system depends on the time scale that you're considering. And on shorter time scales, it becomes restricted to and captured in this diagram, which at least in my field is quite famous. It's called the Brotherton diagram. And in this
Tim,
case,
sorry, may I interrupt? Because we're all hanging at your every word, but somehow we can't see the slides. So maybe you have to share your presentation a different way because the graph you were talking about sounded so interesting. We really wanted to see it.
Well done for interrupting. Can you
Sorry.
see?
Okay, so that now we see a diagram, Tim.
Yeah, let's do it this way. Can you see that okay?
Very well.
Okay. Hey ho. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is a famous diagram of what NASA would view as the Earth system on the shortest time scales. So it's named after the chair of the committee that came up with this report in the 1980s. And in this version of the Earth system, the interior of the Earth, the rocks, the volcanoes are treated as outside the system. And we're really focused on shorter timescales and human influences, which you can see in there. But again, this is just an Earth system which is portrayed in terms of, or identified in terms of interactions. It brings us into the 1990s, where the chief institution that began to take over the definition of the Earth system became the International Geosphere Biosphere Program. And their Earth system was really focused on the global changes affecting human existence. So they focused on a very short time scale, and to define the boundaries of their Earth system, all you need to do is identify the conditions that humans need to exist and consider all the processes that affect those conditions of habitability for humans. So that drastically restricts the timescale of focus. It means that mostly we'd be concerned with the last 10,000 years of what stratigraphers would call the Holocene. Now, this has been an influential view of our planet, and it's led to notions like the Anthropocene, which I'm sure has been discussed already this evening, to my own work on tipping points and the fact that as we go about changing the planet on a global scale, not all the changes will be smooth. And it's led to the concept of planetary boundaries. Again, that we need to somehow define safe boundaries to keep the Earth system habitable for us humans. All useful stuff, but if we tried to land in the IGBP's Earth system, we'd soon be in trouble, because by focusing just on what's required for human life, this takes for granted several of our conditions of existence, such as an oxygen-rich atmosphere, which are actually there thanks to a long history of other life forms and are continually being maintained by other life forms. And this view readily, looks over that, if not ignores it, which brings us to the third and the oldest of the three views I'm going to talk about, which is Gaia. And I'd say it's only in Gaia that life is absolutely recognized as absolutely central. And that's captured here in this plot of the atmospheric compositions of our planet Earth and of its neighbors, Mars and Venus. As Jim Lovelock first realized or discovered in the mid-1960s, life has been and continues to be radically transforming the atmosphere of our planet. We're all breathing an atmosphere rich in oxygen, but mixed in with that are trace amounts of highly reactive gases like methane and hydrogen. And that can only be so because living things are continually maintaining this extraordinary state of disequilibrium, this extremely improbable anomaly of an atmosphere. In fact, it takes the power supply equivalent of about 700 nuclear power stations just to maintain that mix of oxygen and methane there. So life is absolutely central to creating its own conditions of flourishing and habitability on this planet. And yet, ironically, life or Gaia is hard to see in the energy balance of our planet, almost invisible in fact, because all the photosynthetic organisms on this planet capture only about 1% of the sunlight absorbed at the Earth's surface, and they only convert about a third of that 1% into usable energy. Yet with that tiny fraction of these massive energy fluxes that I'm showing here, life is able to completely transform the composition of the atmosphere, and through its informational qualities, if you like, fundamentally alter the nature and the whole organization of our planet. So whilst life or Gaia is hard to spot in the Earth's energy balance, it's kind of blindingly obvious if we look at the flows of materials at the surface of the Earth. Far from being a providential planet for life, in fact, the inner Earth offers only a very meager supply of the elements that life needs, plotted here as the fluxes of gases coming out of volcanoes on the right-hand side without life. On the left, we see these extraordinarily massive fluxes of gases that are largely, almost entirely due to life. And this is the signature of life recycling all the materials it needs to build its bodies. And you couldn't get a better illustration of how life is creating its own flourishing, its own conditions of habitability on Earth and in Gaia. So to identify this Gaia thing, we've got to basically identify all the living things on Earth. We've got to trace carefully their chemical and material connections beyond their membranes to their outside surroundings, like these fluxes of gases. We need to establish which of those effects and connections are relevant to habitability on this planet. And then we'll have identified in that network of connections an entity that we can call Gaia. Now, as scientists like me, we can then puzzle and try to reason over how come outcomes that promote habitability and stability on our planet over billions of years have come to predominate. And that's a work in progress. But it's in Gaia that we'll have found a safe place to land, as Lovelock put it, as part or partner in a very democratic entity. Well, that's really what I wanted to say, but I thought I'd amuse you by leaving you with a quote from William Blake at a rather more providential position on the matter, leaving thinkers like me in a state of sorrow and desperation for having turned to the earth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim.
I find it wonderful that you ask the question where to land. Yeah? So my question is, how can we be sure that to answer this question, how to land? In your study, we see a new model of the Earth cycles and the earthly systems. So are these models a help that we can land on Earth, the plankton?
Well, Peter, they might at least give us some guidance, not only as to the nature of the extraordinary phenomenon or system that we're living within. So in what I'm trying to portray is that we're living within Gaia, and Gaia is something within the planet as a whole, something that it's extended itself in space and time to dominate some aspects of the workings of our world, those that are most important for the flourishing of life, but to have a lesser effect on others. But in terms of looking for a new earthly politics and where to land, it's not the whole answer, but I believe if we're collectively searching for what will give us a sustainable, flourishing future on this planet as a species, then it can give us some very clear lessons about the need to power our civilization from sustainable energy, to recycle all the materials that we need to flourish, and to organize ourselves in a less hierarchical way in terms of the flows of information, and to maintain diversity as well, because all of these things give an extraordinary robustness to Gaia, and there's no reason to think they wouldn't also give a robustness or a resilience to and a flourishing to human civilization.
I think you made a book using the term environmental evolution. What is the difference between the Darwinian idea of evolution and your concept of environmental evolution?
Well, the Darwinian concept of evolution for most people is still the idea that life adapts to an environment that's somehow being given to it by the forces of geology, or if you're of religious inclination, by God. The difference in our view of the Earth system or Gaia now is to recognize that life is profoundly transforming what we call the environment, as well as being shaped by that environment that it's transforming. So we have to get out of that dichotomy of life, non-life, life, environment. And we have to see the totality, the web of the two, the living and the non-living connected together as something that's evolving. And that rather lends us to some differences of emphasis, to look, for example, at why some ways of being with the non-living persist and flourish for longer than other ways of being. And it should shift our perspective away from this neo-Darwinian, at least, focus on competition, replication, and more towards these considerations of survival and flourishing.
Thank you, Tim. Now Bruno has a question to Tim.
Well, I think we will hear more about that from Sébastien and probably from Simon, but the very important adjective Tim used is the word providential, because one of the reasons why it took so long for Gaia to be taken not only as a scientific concept, respectable, but also as an important cosmological concept, as this exhibition is showing, is because people in the different sciences accuse the Gaia's argument to be providential. And the great thing, which is in the catalog, there are 3 papers by Tim and Sébastien, is to show that it's exactly the opposite, is that it's actually Gaia because it gives the ability of making and shaping and engineering the environment to life form, which is less providential than the classical argument that it's just by coincidence or by miracle that life is adapted or trying to adapt to environment. So I'm very pleased, of course, to have Sébastien and Tim here. But I just want to underline that the catalog is also providing a novel view of Gaia. And if I'm not mistaken, it's the first time, Simon will tell me if I'm wrong, that Gaia is also at the center of a major exhibition in art, which is an interesting, it proves the concept which was discovered 40 years ago is now mature, so to speak.
Thank you, Bruno. That is a good connection to just roll now Sebastian's film.
I will try to show that the idea that Gaia is alive is not only to be thought of as a metaphor comparing the Earth with an organism which has changed how we think about the Earth, but also as an ontological statement that the Earth's material surface is part of life which has changed how we think about life. So I'll start with some detail on the common view that Gaia is a metaphor. When they introduced the Gaia hypothesis, Lovelock and Margulis suggested that the total ensemble of living organisms which constitute the biosphere can act as a single entity to regulate chemical composition, surface pH, and possibly also climate. The importance of the idea of regulation led Lovelock to compare the functioning of the Earth's surface with that of an organism, and also sometimes with a thermostat or with a cybernetic system with feedback loops. Organisms and thermostat are indeed the two paradigmatic examples of regulated systems. But instead of considering Lovelock and Margulis' major discovery as a metaphor, I think we should see it as an ontological statement recognizing the existence of a new entity which remains to be studied. Standard biological objects include organisms, cells, communities, populations, ecosystems, genes, and biologists study their boundaries, how they grow and spread, reproduce, die, and regulate. The first article introducing Gaia's name presented it as a new object whose existence can be recognized through the observation of Earth's atmosphere intriguing properties. Lovelock and Margulis used various expressions such as living beings, the total ensemble of living beings, the biosphere, to designate the entities they are interested in. When they use the term life in such context, I think they make a novel use of the term. We should indeed distinguish two different homonyms of the term life. The first one is the term of class with necessary and sufficient properties. It is the one we use when we see Gaia as a metaphor. We say that the Earth is like life because regulation is one of the important properties of the living entities. So the common use of the term life is that of a term of class of which organisms are instances. By contrast, life with a capital L designates not a class, but an individual localized in space and time. This individual originated on Earth when the first organism arose, and it has spread over Earth's surface and maintained itself ever since. Here, life with a capital L should thus be construed as a proper name designating an individual. And standard organisms like horses and bacteria are not instances of life, a capital L, but a part of it. Certain biological disciplines had already studied life beforehand. For instance, paleontologists have long studied the various appearances that life has taken over its long history. But Gaia's research program can be understood as the triggering of new questions about life, capital L, and specifically about life ecology. What are life's conditions of existence? This is the habitability question. Or what is life's relationship with its environment and how it has dealt with it over billions of years? How far does life expand in space, from the crust to the atmosphere, and in time, in the past and in the future? What are the boundaries of life's influence? How does it compare with abiotic forces? Gaia's research program hinged on a conception of life which brought important shift. Of course, the two most striking conceptual shifts are the global view on the idea that life actively influences its environment rather than passively adapts to it. But there are other significant shifts brought by the Gaia hypothesis regarding how we think about the relationship between life and its physical environment on the one hand, and regarding the individual-collective relationship on the other. If you look at evolutionary biology or ecology, the physical environment is mostly conceived as an ensemble of resources, that is, of stocks of products that are consumed by organisms and which get exhausted as the population grows exponentially. And the individual-collective relationship is conceived as a cost-benefit analysis of the action of individuals within the groups to which they belong. These conceptions cross over standard biological theory and classical theory in economics. The conception of life endorsed by the proponents of the Gaia hypothesis shift these standard views. In Gaia theory, the environment is not conceived as a resource, but as a variable which brings a biological optimum for a given value, and, for that matter, should be tightly regulated around this value. The dreadful horizon is no longer the scarcity and finiteness of resources, but the possibility that the regulation of the variable against external perturbation may fail. The cost-benefit analysis is besides hindered since the most important effects brought by individuals within Gaia are the product of their metabolic waste. For Lovelock and for Margulis, Gaia's research program was not, or at least not only, abstract, theoretical, and speculative. They both had a very practical, concrete, and hands-on approach to it. For Lovelock, Gaia's story is embedded in several decades of practical work as an engineer and consultant for major scientific institutions of the earth and environmental sciences, as well as for major private companies, and notably petroleum and chemical ones. These works, and for that matter Gaia's history, boiled down to Lovelock's invention of the electron capture detector in the late 50s, which enables to measure minute quantities of chemical substances. With this instrument, he made numerous atmospheric measures. You can see him here with his daughter in Ireland, gathering atmospheric samples to measure their CFC's contents. He crossed oceans on board of oceanographic vessels and the stratosphere on board of military planes to measure and follow the chemical traces left by life and human activities in the atmosphere and oceans. This leads us to a new understanding of the idea that Gaia is alive. By that, Lovelock meant not only that the Earth's surface functions like an organism, he literally meant that the atmosphere, the oceans, and the Earth's surface are a part of life, capital L. Let me start with a familiar example. When we look at the physiology of termites, we see that they live in a particular environment, namely the termite mound they have built. In the mound, the temperature and gas concentrations, such as CO2, are controlled by the termites. They can modify, for example, the aeration and orientation of the termite mound. So if we are interested in the physiology of termites, we must recognize that the most important physiological activity, that is to say the regulation of certain vital variables, is not only exercised within Claude Bernard's milieu intérieur, that is to say within the material boundaries delimited by the exoskeleton of each of the termites, but that it is also exercised outside these material boundaries, at the very level of the termite mound. Hence the conclusion drawn by the physiologist Scott Turner: the termite mound corresponds to the extended organism. Hence also the ambivalence of the idea that the termite mound will be alive or an organism. We can understand this idea either in the form of an analogy or a metaphor. The termite mound is living because it is regulated as organisms are, or in a very different way. The termite mound is a part of termites, it is a vital extension, and we were simply misguided in localizing the termite within the boundaries of their exoskeleton. Between termites and the termite mound, the flows of matter and energy are incessant, so that it is no longer possible to isolate a termite from the living conditions it helps to create. This is exactly what Lovelock meant when he said that the atmosphere can be seen as a component part of the biosphere, rather than as a mere environment for life, and when he compared the atmosphere to the fur of a mink or the shell of a snail. As Tim Lenton shows in his conference, life's influence is pervasive on parts of the globe that we were used to consider purely geological, physical, or chemical, such as atmosphere, oceans, soils, and rocks. So much so that just as for the termite mounds, it becomes impossible to stop the boundaries of life at the membrane of cells or at the epidermis of standard organisms. Their vital activity expands to the Earth's surface that they literally have contributed to construct, built, and maintained. The interaction between life and its global environment is so intense and dense that for Lovelock, life and its environment constitute an entity or a system which he called Gaia. So Gaia as an entity is life, capital L, plus the environment with which it actively interacts. In order to clarify further the distinction between the metaphor and the ontological statement, it is useful to think about other planets. Mars or Venus can have climatic and chemical conditions which are regulated in the sense that they do not vary too much against external perturbations. If so, they would share properties with organisms of thermostats. But contrary to the Earth, they would not literally be living since there is no life on it, so their surface would have been entirely built by chemical and physical forces.
Thank you, Sebastian. And now we will go to Bruno. Bruno has a response.
Well, it's certainly not a response because I learn from Sébastien quite a lot, especially since his thesis. It's the first thesis completely on the history, cognitive and practical history of Gaia theory by Lovelock. So I'm not going to comment, especially because with Tim, they wrote a series of very important chapters, again, in the catalog. But I would be interested now to hear what Tim says about the reinterpretation that Sébastien is doing of the notion of life, because one of the big issues we encountered when we started to develop again the notion, or clarify, let's say, the notion of Gaia, it was not clear why the biologists had missed the argument. And of course, the great virtue of Sébastien's argument, which is recapped just now, was to make this distinction between life and life. And of course, Tim, coming from another discipline, would have another view of that shift in the definition of life.
Biology is a diverse subject in itself, Bruno, but Seb is quite right that most biologists have been focused on life with a small l, the organisms and the processes of life at the organismal level. I think it's extremely valuable to be able to identify this totality of life with a capital L in it, and as what biologists would call a clade, or perhaps the biggest clade, the grouping of all things that have left descendants into the present. One of the ironies for me is that one of the arch critics of Gaia, a character called Ford Doolittle, a famous microbiologist, has gone from being obsessed with life with a small l to recognizing the same thing that Seb has shown us, which is the importance of life, the totality and the collective. And what it's going to help us do is it's going to help us think more broadly about evolution, because, well, species can speciate and individuals can produce offspring. Clades don't cladate. They don't. Life as a capital doesn't make copies of itself, but that doesn't mean that it isn't profoundly important in shaping our world. And it makes us think in terms of evolution of being about the relative persistence and flourishing, if you like, of different clades, and in this case, the biggest one.
Well, I wanted to hear how Sébastien is now considering the notion of critical zone, because actually this is not obvious. When I talk to my friends, many of them are in the catalog, are in the show, about Gaia, they are critical zonists, but they don't want to hear too much about Gaia. And I'd like to know now, after all these years working together and working with critical zone, how would Sébastien make the connection? It's very clearly in the catalog. We start with critical zone, then Gaia, then the terrestrial, because we are trying to get more and more in the ground. But how would he himself, as an historian, would see the connection?
Thank you. Bueno, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So say the view that I have will be historical and not judging on the present status of the critical zone and geochemistry. The only point I want to emphasize is the fact that the relationship between the Gaia hypothesis and the Gaia proponents and geochemistry, which is the discipline within which the critical zones emerge, is a complicated one, because geochemists were the community to which Lovelock and Margulis first and foremost talk in the very early papers, and so this is the disciplines to which Gaia was addressed. And the main message Lovelock had for geochemists was that they should take into account much more than they did before the influence of life and its geological environment. And the point they made was that the history of the chemistry of the atmosphere and of the oceans is often told without taking account this influence of life and this chemistry. And I think whether contemporary geochemists like it or not, a lot of them have been influenced in some way by Lovelock and Margulis' message of the 70s and the 80s, and this message has transformed the fields in this direction.
Okay, I have a question to Tim and to Sébastien. I would try to summarize what I have learned from your lectures, that our audience understands better the paradigm shift in life sciences, that our audience understands better the revolution which has taken place today. You have made a citation of the sentence of Lovelock, atmosphere is part of the biosphere, right? Normally, atmosphere is a physical chemical reaction, not part of biology. When I understand you correctly, Gaia hypothesis means life is not only built up based on biotica, on animated material, it is also based on inanimated, non-abiotica. So that means we have to find a new conception of life, which also includes material, which was anorganic material. For example, a rock, as you have in the example of the termites, a rock is not normally part of the life cycle. But now we understand a rock, which is a physical chemical process, is also an abiotic material, is part of the life cycle. If I understand you correctly, this is precisely what I think is a new idea of the life sciences, that we have anorganic and non-organic material have to be compounded and coupled in hammer. Do I understand you correctly, Tim and Sébastien?
Yes, and I think one of the important points is the very fact that the distinction organic versus inorganic becomes very hard to pinpoint. I mean, if you just take the example of the atmosphere again, if you look at the composition of the atmosphere, it's a common claim and fact that all of the oxygen of the atmosphere, which is 20% of atmosphere content, has been produced by living activity. Another fact, which is less often mentioned, but sometimes discussed, is the fact that living organisms may also have influenced atmospheric pressure by modifying the oxygen and the nitrogen content of the atmosphere. So there is no more physical parameters as atmospheric pressure, and yet this atmospheric pressure may have been influenced and transformed by living activity. So the point was really that the biotic, abiotic, or organic, inorganic distinction becomes extremely fuzzy if you look
at the connections between what you think were the living beings on the one hand and what you thought were their environment on the other hand.
In cybernetics, we speak about loops and feedbacks. And I think there's a good example to understand what you mean. Some plants and some algae in millions of years have produced the atmosphere, the oxygen. No? So they have changed the environment. And now this new environment, the atmosphere, allows the rise and the birth of new species. So that means without the work of the algae and the plants, we would not have an atmosphere. And without the atmosphere, we would not have the people, like the beings like we, who have lungs. So we can say the lung is a reaction to the atmosphere, and the atmosphere is a product of the work of plants. And I think this is that model what you explained to us, Tim and Sébastien.
That's right, Peter. Yeah. We're really trying to emphasize that we're all concerned now, I think, as people, that we're knocking the planet out of whack. We're somehow disrupting something that was somewhat stable before, is our life support system in a simple language. But if we want to understand that life support system and we want to have a good relationship with it, then it's absolutely crucial that we have to trace these interconnections from the obviously living things to the things we thought of and labeled the environment or the non-living. We have to trace that intricate web of connections across space and time. And then we'll see this extraordinary entity, Gaia, in that network. And then we'll be staring at our life support system. And we need to find the right relationship, in simple terms, with that life support system. You can only do that if you recognize it properly first.
All right. So I think now is a good moment to pass on to our next guest speaker. But before we do that, could we please take a moment to acknowledge that thanks to you, Bruno, you are giving us the voices of a completely different species, the voice of crickets. It's the new rage on Telegram, but also, yes, maybe if we could have Bruno's sound on for just like 10 seconds and listen to the crickets. Otherwise, I hope they didn't go to sleep right now in this very second, because we could hear the crickets up until now. Did they go silent again? Oh,
no, they're sleeping.
Okay, so now the crickets went to sleep, but. Yes, we had all the crickets with us, so up until now. And on Telegram, we had the wonderful wordplay that now it's a cricket zone, or also, what was the new word? The critical zone. That was really lovely. And even before that happened, we were also happy to be able to listen to non-human voice in our panel. So Bruno, thank you so much for that. Do you want to say quickly something before we leave and go into Simon Schaffer's talk?
No, unfortunately, I have a bad hearing, so I didn't hear the critical cricket.
But we hear the crickets now again. Please unmute. Don't unmute yourself. The crickets are so nice. But we will now go into the Simon Schaffer lecture, and thank you so much.
Well, hi. The notion of the critical zone is a geodesic concept, strongly linked to the behavior of the planet's crust. But it's also a temporal concept with specific histories. It's worth tracing some of the key themes on which models of the critical zone depend. And here I want to bring out especially the ideas that the Earth is alive and that its human populations affect Earth's history. For example, in several European traditions, the notion of an animate Earth was much more than mere metaphor. The aim of such images was to bring out the systemically interconnected quality of the cosmos. In the 16th century, the eminent Naples natural philosopher Giambattista della Porta spelt out the detailed consequences of such claims. The system of the world was bound in what he called a good neighborhood, The parts of the world, according to him, politically and physically, were like common members of a living being. Early modern European natural philosophy was full of graphic images like these. Here's one, it's actually my favorite, and I'll quote. "To be sure, the world is not an animal like a dog, attentive to every nod. It's an animal like an ox or an elephant, slow to anger and all the more violent when it's been aroused." 4 centuries ago, the astronomer Johannes Kepler made this evocative comparison between our world and an animate being. In his 1619 book, Harmonies of the World, he was addressing a great problem in early modern astronomy, the question of the close causal relationships linking humans dwelling on Earth with states of affairs in the world. Kepler also wished somehow to emphasize how variable and tricky were these causal connections. He was using the word climate in its classical sense as a geographical term for an earthly region of uniform condition. Laying out climate distribution was hard because links between the heavens and the earth were fundamentally variable and tricky. There could thus be discord between the activity of celestial agents and events on Earth. But when these principles combined properly, the effects might then be very dramatic and violent, and yet explicable and so predictable. Hence emerged a fascinating model of causal action. It's a model that's much richer than that normally defined by the very familiar distinction between organic and mechanical models of the cosmos. Kepler was explicitly violating the received boundaries between the affairs of the earth, which was the world of physics, and the celestial dominion of the heavens. He argued that, and I quote, "The earth is a body like that of an animate being," unquote. Weather on this planet was moved by exactly the same causes that were exerted by the human soul inside the body. Kepler developed the connection in physiologically exhaustive and self-absorbed detail. Under a list of activities of the Earth's soul, he compared trees with the planet's hairs, insects with its lice, thunder and lightning with its inflammable farts, rain with its sweat. The implications that Kepler drew from this account of the animate Earth and the mechanisms of weather and meteorology were much debated throughout the 17th century. This form of planetary dynamics was based, we've seen, on a fundamental claim about animate powers and circulating rhythms. Kepler's greatest 17th century disciple and analyst was Isaac Newton, and Newton followed the model very closely indeed. In an important document summarizing his own alchemical cosmology, Newton described a universal circulation in the world. My quote from him, "This earth," he writes, "resembles a great animal. It draws in breath for its daily refreshment and vital ferment, and it breathes out again with gross exhalations," unquote. Thus far, Newton. The claim about this great animal allowed Newton to identify what he called nature's universal agent. Newton was understanding the world much more as a living being than as a dead machine. It was characterized by transpiration and circulation. These early modern natural philosophers and astronomers held a shared set of assumptions that the comparison of world with animal was legitimate and effective, and it underwrote a systemic model of the cosmos. A distinct, different, but complementary presumption emphasized ways in which humans would be a decisive agent in the Earth's history. Notion of humankind's role in Earth's history were often expressed by 17th century cosmologists. The deluge, Noah's flood, provided a peculiarly dramatic example for them of where what people did changed dramatically how the world was. Actions of human beings, they thought, had produced large-scale moral and physical effects in the world. Numerous natural philosophers and clerics argued that there were close connections between physical causes and the advent of key events in Earth's history. At the very same moment as the appearance and publication of Newton's own cosmology, naturalists publicized claims that the history of humans was responsible through physical causes under the guidance of providence for the crises of the globe. According to them, in the development of planet's history, this is how they put it, mankind leads the way. So, within this pair of traditions, the Earth is an animal, humans affect Earth history, there was a potent identification of the bodies of the Earth, of people, and of the universe. And ever since, complicated relations have existed between the idea of the Earth as an animal, especially its use to insist on the world's systematic unity, and the notion of humans' dramatic effects on the world system. And as we know, these relations have gained poignancy through current programs to define the precise chronology of human-caused changes and the geology and ecology of the planet. It's claimed that humanity's effects have now reached the scale and the intensity of other macro-planetary causes. It's supposed that the Earth's responsiveness to human action cannot be properly understood within a cosmology based on passive and mechanical agents alone, and it's claimed that faith in the active, nearby entities who populate what's come to be called Gaia help make Earth's response look much more understandable, even self-evident. Well, that supposition seems to me to rely very often on the idea that sometime in Europe's early modernity, the worldview was mechanized. The cosmos was turned into a machine. And the claim that by contrast, in models of Gaia, it's become less like automatic machinery, more animate, more responsive. But it seems to me there are ways in which that's a misleading and in some respects unhelpful history. We've just seen that in early modernity, there were very common notions that the Earth was animate. There's a vital relation between traditions of human agency and of a living planet embodied in early modernity. And in the enterprises in which, at the end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s, Alexander von Humboldt and his many collaborators engaged, models of the system of the world were turned into accounts of the Earth's system. Humboldt's great survey was, of course, entitled Cosmos, a sketch of a physical description of the universe. It's a work he started writing in 1819. He was really worried about what he should call it. In the end, he chose Cosmos because it explicitly, just like Kepler, linked the heavens with the Earth, precisely because, as he put it explicitly, it is quite opposed to Gaia. Gaia, at that point, meant a stolid, boring textbook story of Earth's geography. So Humboldt and the Creole mobile naturalists of 1800 aimed to innovate the survey sciences, the biogeography, the cosmology that they'd inherited and that they'd accumulated. They put together resources to suggest how living beings played a fundamental role in the planet's career. Their mapping and surveying helped make theories of the critical zone. Their insight that the thin biofilm near the planet's surface was where atmosphere and geology have been modified by life draws much of its plausibility from the organic data systems inaugurated at that early 19th century aggressive imperial moment. Several versions, however, of geophysiology have selected instead a machinist and teleological model of the Earth system, which is indebted quite directly to the carbonization of the world economy, which was launched at exactly the same moment. This is an unfortunate provenance that sometimes undermines the very enterprise whose ancestry is at stake for us now. By reflecting instead on the preconditions of the systems of representation, information, and combination that have made possible the modeling of and inquiry into the biogeography of the Earth's surface and crust, I think a better history and perhaps even a better politics of the critical zone would eventually emerge. Thank you.
Simon, I would like to be sure that I understand you correctly. We praise Kepler and Newton for discovering the planetary motions. But after Humboldt, we discover that this mechanical image of the world is not enough. At that time, when Kepler made his invention, we thought it is a kind of humiliation, because suddenly we realized we are living not in the center of the universe. We have now a new heliocentric picture of the world. But now it seems we are, with Gaia theory, we are coming to a different conclusion. Now again, we can say we are the center of the world because we are the only habitable planet. We are the only planet in the whole universe, as we know now, where life exists. So that means, in a certain sense, we are now going back before Kepler and before Newton, because again, we have to realize we are the center. Bruno, do you want to comment it?
No, I wait for the question. I just ask if I could ask a question after that.
Okay, Simon, please, your answer.
Well, I'm painfully aware that at 10:30, which is about a quarter of an hour ago, the bar opened, according to our original schedule. So I'm going to be fantastically rude and try and give very, very brief answers to very, very profound questions. Here, the answer, the brief version of the answer would go something like this. What my intervention was supposed to suggest is that we've got the history of early modernity completely wrong, and that error plays itself out politically now in exactly the controversies that both Tim and Sebastian have been describing, by reclaiming a very, very different Kepler and Newton from those who currently function as the policemen of mechanization. We might have some hope of reorganizing the ways in which scientific authority is put to work in current debates, or at least the authority of a certain track record that it's assumed the sciences have, right? Earth system science is science, and it needs to be understood and debated like that. I do think that Humboldt plays, therefore, I'll say this very quickly, an absolutely critical role in helping us reorganize now what counts as the history of models of this planet. On your subsidiary question, is this planet the sole home of life, with a capital L in Sebastian's sense? There are other people, some of whom don't live on this planet, who are much more expert than I at answering that question.
Thank you, Simon. Understand, we have to correct our view. Newton and Kepler have not been.
It's certainly bizarre. I mean, it isn't necessary, perhaps, to say this in central German lands.
Yeah.
In North American lands, in Anglo-Saxony, it's very important to say this. Very important. There are many different Keplers, and there are many different early modernities, right? And they play fascinatingly different political roles. I'll just leave it there.
I understand you, Simon, thank you. We have to correct our view. Newton and Kepler are not the policemen of the mechanical world. We have to make a reinterpretation correctly. And therefore, I go directly to Bruno Latour to ask a question.
Well, I see the problem with historians is that they find difficulties in the naive idea we have about cut in the way science progress. So I'd like to know from Sébastien or from Tim, maybe starting from Tim, what does it do? Especially because Tim has been a student of Simon many years ago. I mean, not so many years ago. And what he makes of the idea that, in fact, we are simply now today redistributing all sorts of quality between life, organic, inorganic, social activity, causality, responsibility, human activity. But in fact, it's a much longer history. And of course, in the catalog, you will read 2 chapters by Simon, where he made this very important point that mechanistic universe has never actually existed. I mean, we have never been modern. All these things have never actually been actuated. But I'd like to know from Tim and then from Sébastien what we think of this idea that, in fact, the originality of Gaia is still to be debated, and it's not so easy to extract it from a much longer and richer history.
Well, I'm excited by Simon's interjection. I mean, I realize already that history is written by the victors, and I paid enough attention in Simon's lectures more than 25 years ago to know that Newton was an alchemist on the side. So I would always have harbored a suspicion, if not a knowledge, that this organic thread is weaved through the history of this Anglo-Saxon, or whatever we want to call it, science. But obviously it's been, you might say it's been suppressed by a different worldview or a different agenda that's come to dominate. So I'd like to get behind Simon and try and rediscover some of that continuity, because I would agree with him that actually this continuity of I don't know whether it should be called organic thought, but would help us a great deal, perhaps, in trying to get perhaps even my scientific colleagues to take more seriously the live debate and progress we're in the middle of right now, to really try and see the Earth or Gaia for what it is. Because for the most part, they just can't be bothered. They're just quite happy to buy a crude mechanistic narrative.
And answering your question, Bruno, I was of course impressed by Simon's point, and I would have absolutely no argument to disagree, especially since I barely know anything of the period of which he is an expert. And the only thing I will like to mention is that I was myself extremely surprised and impressed to read papers from savants from the late 18th century to the late 19th century, which really read like Lovelock in the text. But the fact, I think, is that, of course, many of Lovelock's ideas do not come from nowhere, and perhaps we have a lot of these which were there before. But on the other hand, within the context of the second part of the 20th century, the state of the scientific disciplines in which Lovelock found geochemistry, ecology, and other disciplines is such that Lovelock had still a valid point regarding the, so to speak, originality of his thesis and argument.
I absolutely agree with that. I mean, one of the points that I'd want to add, we don't really have time to get into this, but I'll try, is our meeting today began fascinatingly with a discussion about the notion of ghost acres, of ghost lands, of all the territories that industrialization and carbonization have bizarrely summoned into existence, right? In around 1830, Britain, for example, the fastest industrializing country at that point, had, say, under 2 million acres of forest, right? And its colonial and, above all, its carbonized development in that decade produced tens of millions of ghost acres elsewhere, so that it's been estimated that by the 1830s, 1840s, the coal consumption of the United Kingdom was equivalent to doubling the size of the United Kingdom in terms of its production. That's the context in which the debates that I've been trying to talk about took place. They did not take place simply in terms of a highly romanticized confrontation between a Prussian mining administrator and some very high mountains in South America. They also simultaneously take place at the moment of the most intense carbonization then experienced in human history, whose consequences our exhibition, Bruno and Peter's exhibition, is designed to unlock. And once we reorganize the official memory of the doctrines about our planet, whether it's alive and whether humans play a role in its history, I think we can also see much more clearly what the relationship is, say, between survey sciences and the model of the planet and ghost acres, which is absolutely fundamental for the story that the exhibition is telling. Bruno.
No, I just wanted to say that what Simon said is a beautiful connection with what will happen tomorrow when we hear Joseph Kerner about paintings, because the romantic period that Joseph mentioned is exactly taken by this tension, which is usually ignored when people do history of art. So this is just a little pointer so that people can stay tomorrow tuned. Stay tuned, as people said in the past.
After Wirtschaft, Landschaft.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. I would like to use this opportunity. To express on the knees of my heart my gratitude for this wonderful evening that you shared with us your knowledge and your expertise. We have learned a lot. The audience has learned a lot. And I think tonight was a really historic moment because we invented the future of the museum. As I said at the beginning, a normal museum is locally bound, has a local audience, like a cinema. And today we have a non-local audience like television. So you can see in future the museum will be, metaphorically speaking, a cinema and a television. We will be a broadcasting institution, not only a museum, an assembly of objects. And also we invented today, I think, the future of television, because television normally is just a cinema for non-local audiences, because they show one film after another. They do not use the technology which is available. We tried tonight to use this new technology to assemble wonderful people who shared revolutionary ideas with us. Thank you deeply, deeply. Bruno, please. You should have the last word. Thank you, all of you. Thank you so much, all the people tonight. Thanks also to the team of ZKM. Bruno, please have the last word.
I'd love to have a last word, but we have 2 more evenings to go. And for this night, I think the tradition for the next television or the next cinema or whatever Peter is imagining is always to finish with my friend Simon Schaffer's talk, because I think that's the best way to end and to have a complete sort of sculptural statement about how we should think. So many thanks to everybody, but many thanks to Simon.
With an open bar party, because that's usually also the end of every great opening that we have, the first evening, having a party at the HFG, the art school next door, whom you collaborated with so closely. So I think closing off this amazing evening that we've had with Bruno, with Peter, with all of our amazing guest speakers, whom I want to thank dearly, and also Annette for taking us so deep into the critical zone, into Gaia, or into the critical zone, as our amazing Telegram community has rebaptized our live streaming festival. Actually, that's also the moment where I want to give a huge thank you to our amazing community on Telegram. We are absolutely overwhelmed with how many people have been tuning in, so thank you for this. Apparently I have to say something else. What else? Yes. Okay, that's huge. Apparently we've had 8,000 people tuning in tonight. That is a number that I can't even, I don't know what to say, it makes me speechless. So thank you. It's not only our work, it's the work of everybody who contributed for tonight, so thank you so much. And this is actually a good moment to now take a breath, because we are now going to enter into the open bar. If you want, I mean, if you're still awake now, we're gonna have a drink, we're gonna relax, give some behind the scenes information. And you can find the link to the Zoom conference on our website. Apparently there's something else to say. Okay, hang on just 1 second. I finished the technical details. So if you want to join us on our open bar on Zoom, you can just find the link on our website. You click on it. Unfortunately, after 100 people are in the bar on Zoom, the bar is closed, but you can still be there on the YouTube live stream and just, enjoy your drinks and still follow anyway and send us your comments on Telegram. So that's our next step. And right, Mr. Weibel.
If we would have had a normal opening, what I call for the local people, for the local audience, we would have a maximum of 1,000 people. Tonight, we turned into a broadcasting institution, and we had about more than 8,000 people, 8,000 non-local audience. This is really a triumph, what can be done with the tele-technology. Bruno, you're not convinced yet, but in 2 days you will be convinced.
All right, so party, and we see you in, we'll take a short break, so maybe 10 minutes we'll have to see. See you. Bye, and see you tomorrow.